Hello, I'm Darine Abougaida. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, exit from the pandemic, trillions spent on keeping the global economy ticking over. But how much is needed to get the world back on its feet by getting vaccines to those without deep pockets? Also this week, how the threat of U.S. decoupling is forcing China to rethink its growth plans with an ambitious goal of 1 billion middle-class citizens. Plus, can cash-strapped Zimbabwe strike oil? We'll tell you about the little-known Australian company that's using maps from the 1990s to find oil. Without a COVID-19 vaccine, millions of people who lost their jobs due to the pandemic are unlikely to find work. Some businesses are struggling more than others to operate at full capacity, and governments, central banks, and development banks will need to provide trillions in aid to keep economies ticking over. Well, the pandemic has also set back the fight against poverty reduction by more than a decade. So, just where are we with the hunt for a vaccine? There are more than 200 vaccines in various stages of development. That's according to the World Health Organization. In August, Russia registered the first vaccine, although at the time it had been tested on fewer than 80 people. The most promising from AstraZeneca and Oxford University was paused temporarily after one participant became ill. So as the hunt continues, governments have spent about $10 trillion in various stimulus programs to keep economies ticking over. The cost to the global economy of the pandemic could be as high as $9 trillion. That's according to the Asian Development Bank, and that's huge sums of money. But the cost of exiting the pandemic by getting vaccines to the world's poorest doesn't have to cost the Earth. Right now, the World Health Organization has launched a program to raise $35 billion to make sure vaccines reach low-income and developing countries. The WHO wants to make sure it can deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. From Geneva, I'm joined by Dr. Bruce Aylward. He's a senior advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization. Thanks very much for your time with us, Dr. Bruce Aylward, on Counting the Cost. So, in the history of vaccine development, there hasn't been such a Herculean effort to get a vaccine into circulation. From your perspective, from the WHO perspective, where are we in this effort, and can we expect the serious contenders here by the end of the year?
Indeed, this has been a Herculean effort, and what the World Health Organization and our partners have put together is an integrated international effort we call the ACT Accelerators, to try and accelerate the availability of vaccines as rapidly as possible. The end of this year is going to be very, very ambitious. The leading candidates, 10 leading vaccines, are in what we call phase 3 trials. They're going to have to be completed. We're going to have to generate the safety data, analyze those data. So it's going to be very, very tight for the end of this year. More likely, we're going to be looking at the first quarter of 2021. But it's going to depend a little bit on some factors that we don't control. So it could be anywhere in that time period.
Here's the thing, though. When you look at the private sector development and the production of vaccines, most have said that they're going to be doing this at cost, except Johnson & Johnson. So does that play a role in your choice of where the vaccine comes from?
Well, obviously, it's going to be a balance between getting access to the best possible products as early as possible, as well as the price. Now, we are working through the COVAX facility that we've established. So this is a huge international effort that brings together already 168 countries to procure, to pool their procurement power, to be able to get the best possible prices. So we think that we will be able to negotiate great prices on all of these products. We are aware that there's a range of pricing strategies that countries or companies rather are bringing to the table, but this is still very much an ongoing area of work. And I'd like to highlight, you mentioned Johnson & Johnson, but in fact they've come out saying that they are going to offer at a very good cost. So I'm not sure that that's one of the ones that we'd be most concerned about in terms of getting the best possible prices.
Right. Okay. So out of the more than 150 vaccines currently under development, are they all different, or are there overlapping studies going on?
Yeah, absolutely. The incredible thing about this Herculean effort, as you called it, to develop a vaccine is that we're looking at products that are being developed across 5 or 6 different what we would call technology platforms, using novel new approaches like the mRNA vaccines that you've been hearing about and viral vector vaccines, all the way to more classical approaches like inactivated vaccines. We don't know which of these at this point are going to prove to be the most efficacious or the safest. So we're pursuing an approach that invests across a whole range of technologies, but also, and uniquely in the case of the COVAX facility that we're running, we also look across a whole range of geographies, all the way from the west to the far east, to scan the horizon for the best possible products out of that, what are now well over 200 candidate products that are out there. But of all of those, Doreen, to your point, there's a very small number, only about 10, that are right now in phase 3 trials and that we're really looking at most closely at this point.
Right. So here's the thing. I mean, we hear a lot of the Western developments when it comes to this field, but what of the Chinese and Russian efforts? Well, what's your take on those?
Well, that's a super important point because these countries also have, a long history in developing vaccines and medical products. So they're also important players in the big scheme of things. And when you look at those 10 products that I talked about that are in phase 3 trials, 4 or 5 of those are actually from China and Russia. Well, 1 from Russia and 3 or 4 now from China. So it's incredibly important that we are looking right across the full spectrum of potential products because we don't know yet which of these are going to be successful.
Let me ask you about, let me turn your attention to the U.S. for just a moment and talk us through the antibody treatments that were given to President Trump. How effective were those?
Well, this is a really important area of development. As everybody knows, in going into a battle against an opponent such as the coronavirus or COVID-19, you want to have a full armamentarium of tools. You want to have diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. So one of the big pushes that we've been looking at is in this area of new drugs or therapeutics, let's say. And one of the most promising is what we call these monoclonal antibodies, which are very special antibodies that are developed to try and target the virus. And you give it as an infusion usually before or just as someone is getting ill to try and prevent the progression of the disease. In every one of the studies that have been done so far, they've looked more and more promising, but we are not at an advanced stage to be able to say that this could be approved for emergency use listing yet, or even for licensing. So it's really still the most advanced of these products are only in phase 2 studies at this point.
And looking at the scale of this coronavirus pandemic, the WHO has committed $50 million to these antigen tests and providing also 120 million antigen tests to low and middle income countries. Do you think that's really enough?
Well, this is one of the other breakthroughs that we've had just over the last couple of weeks. So it's really just a start. What we've found working through the ACT Accelerator is 2 new rapid antigen tests that have received emergency use listing by WHO. And in parallel with testing and assessing those products, we've worked with the manufacturers to get price and volume guarantees for low and low middle income countries. Now, there's 120 million tests that can be available over the next 6 months. It's a big improvement on where we are today, but it is not enough. We estimate we need at least 500 million tests over the coming year, and that's what our target is, what we're working toward. But the biggest problem and challenge we're starting to face now, Doreen, is not actually the technology and the products, but rather the financing to be able to procure enough of these to fully exploit the opportunities we have. $50 million is only a tenth of the 500, 600 million that we need to be able to fully operationalize that deal and enhance control in low and low middle income countries.
Right. And speaking of funding, the $35 billion fund to get vaccines to the poorest parts of the world, how are you doing on that? Is that fully funded?
No, and it's a super important point. In fact, the $35 billion budget for or financing gap for the ACT Accelerator, that's the gap across our work on the vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Now, nearly a half of that is in the area of vaccines, however. Now, we've had a really good initial financing, about $4 billion now, that has helped in the startup phase. But now we need to move from the proof of principle to the scale up and procurement of these products in the near term. And that's why we're going to need this tenfold, basically, increase in financing. This is going to require an extraordinary effort. It will not be able to finance this just from overseas development assistance or what we call traditional ODA. And so what we're doing now is laying out the economic case for countries to invest stimulus financing into the ACT Accelerator, because what we are developing and how we will roll it out could be a critical part of the global effort to get global economies moving again, as well as societies and health systems.
Right. Dr. Bruce Aylward, great to talk to you. Thank you very much for speaking to us from the World Health Organization. Thank you. Later this month, China's government will rubber stamp a 5-year economic plan. The 13 previous plans have carefully charted China's move from an agricultural economy to the factory of the world. This plan is likely to chuck out growth targets in favor of quality and structural reforms. In many respects, China has been forced down this path as the United States attempts to decouple from its reliance on the world's second biggest economy. Let's discuss this with Ruben Mondahar. He's joining us from Hong Kong. He's a professor for Asian initiatives for the IESE Business School at the University of Navarra. Thanks very much for your time with us. So I guess efforts to keep growth above 6%, come what may, has been thrown out, and this is partly in response to Washington's economic war.
Partly in response, but they have also many other issues to contend with. So anyway, the main story is what we call the dual circulation, which is the first circulation, called the internal circulation, will be to boost the growth coming from domestic consumption, everything domestic development, for example, of vehicle brands, domestic development of technology, especially in supply chain regarding technology, AI and other things. So all of that domestic, plus the domestic integration within China of the economic growth centers. For example, there are 3. One is the Greater Bay Area surrounding Guangdong province, which includes Guangdong, the city itself. And then the 2 others are the ones around Shanghai and around Beijing. The external is to continue whatever they can do, but remember that this is a different time from all the previous times of China since the beginning of the reforms started by Deng Xiaoping. For example, just to have a quick enumeration, the several T's, the problems they have with several T's, which are all external. T, Taiwan, Tibet, TikTok, Trump, technology, telecommunications, so trade. So all of those are going to be difficult issues for China, plus the geopolitics, the shunning of academic research of China, the battle in public opinion, diplomacy, so all of that, the internet. So all of those are the external circulation that China has to contend with. So they have not contended with these factors in the past. So this will be the first time that they will really have a tough time dealing with their external circulation area. So the solution they have for the external is to develop the relationship with Asia, especially 2 areas. One is the ASEAN, which has a population of about 650 million, approximately like the European Union. And then also the other one is to see what they can do with this regional comprehensive economic partnership, which they want to connect with Asian countries that are nearby China.
Let me ask you what the focus will be then for the next 5 years.
The next 5 years will mean that they will boost anything that is related, for example, to food production, local energy production, consumption of light industrial goods, so services, domestic tourism. So to take advantage of the improving and burgeoning middle class that is happening now in China. They have like 30 to 35% of their population classifies as middle income. So that is a big source of possible domestic growth.
And speaking of growth, now China already has a lead when it comes to 5G and possibly artificial intelligence as well. But now it's identified chips as an area it really needs to focus on because of U.S. sanctions. So how long before it catches up and overtakes the U.S. in this field, if that were to happen?
Well, we are talking here of basic research. That's why over this past 10 to 15 years, China has really been trying to get the technology, to bring the technology from the West to China. At the moment, the real basic kind of technology, microchip semiconductors, for example, they are still dependent on the US. So although this is going to be less and less, China will have to invest more so that they can fast track this. So this will take maybe another decade, but they are doing their best to upgrade their technology in these areas. The supply chain that relates to this technology, the 5G, for example, that is still not 100%, and they can be still affected by the sanctions that the U.S. and even some other Western countries are going to do. Because China, for example, its fast export-driven growth reached a point that it provoked a reaction from the West. It provoked a protectionist kind of element from the West. So then that's what's the picture now. And China is experiencing that at the moment.
Well, one of the biggest challenges will be getting 1 billion people into the middle class. That's going to be some achievement.
Yes, but that also has a cost, because with that also comes the aging of the population. So even if they relax the one-child policy, two-children policy, that's not going to solve immediately. So technology is supposed to fill in the blanks. What the labor force is going to kind of dwindle, that gap left by that dwindling labor force is supposed to be covered up by technology. But technology is not coming fast. And with the current situation that this technology is being hampered because of the sanctions imposed on China by the Western countries, then this is going to be a problem for them. I say that there will be an adjustment period, and I think it will take about 10 years.
That move, however, I guess will not only lead to an economy worth a staggering $30 trillion, that's the figure that's expected, and also surpassing the United States towards the end of the decade, but also it's going to create a huge domestic market, so where the U.S. decoupling has little impact.
The U.S. Policy is very dependent on the current administration. So if Trump wins, then we will see the same story going on. If there will be a dramatic shift, if there's a change in administration, then there could be also a change in China, and the hopes and the timetable will also change. Depends on whether the supply chain will be stopped or whether the supply chain will continue.
Right. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Yeah. Okay.
Issue.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Ruben Mondahar, thank you very much for speaking to us from Hong Kong. Zimbabwe has been in economic trouble for more than a decade. But 2 years ago, there was a ray of hope for the cash-starved nation. The possible discovery of oil and gas in the north of the country on the border with Mozambique. The Energy Minister, Winston Chitando, said the oil and gas deposits are Africa's largest oil reserves discovered to date. The company behind the discovery is little known outside the industry. Invictus Energy is an Australian-listed oil and gas company, and its only real assets are those in Zimbabwe. Well, the find, if proven commercial, could be a game changer. Invictus has already signed a 20-year deal to provide 100 million cubic feet of gas to a local power company. Well, from Perth, Australia via Skype, we're joined by Invictus Energy's managing director and founder, Scott McMillan. Thanks for your time with us today. How much oil and gas deposits do you believe is in the Cabora Bassa region?
We've had some independent estimates carried out, and based on these independent consultants, they've estimated that around about 10 trillion cubic feet and 300 million barrels of condensate could be present in the Cabora Basin. That's equivalent to around 1.9 billion barrels of oil equivalent. So pretty substantial by global standards and something that we're very excited about.
How did you come by this find, however? Because I understand that Mobil, which is now, of course, part of ExxonMobil, did some testing back in the 1990s, and you're using some of their geological studies.
That's correct. So Mobil did carry out an extensive campaign in the early 90s in the Greater Zambezi Valley. And the first part in our exploration program was to reevaluate the data that they left behind. And we were able to obtain the original field tapes and seismic surveys that they acquired, reprocess that data, and shed new light on the basin and its petroleum potential. And now we've concluded those studies, and we're going forward with our own exploration program on the ground. And in fact, we've got a team going into the country and into the basin next week to start some reconnaissance for our infill seismic campaign, which we're planning to start next year following the rainy season.
I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of Mobil, of course, but from your understanding, why did Mobil decide not to drill at the time? Was it not commercially viable for a company of its size?
So Mobil were exploring for big oil targets, and this was back in the early 90s. And when they had finished their evaluation of the basin, they concluded that the petroleum system was more likely to be gas prone as opposed to oil prone. And back then, there was no structured market for gas in the region. And in fact, there were already some large existing discoveries in neighboring Mozambique onshore, the Panda and Tamane fields, which were discovered in the early 60s, that were still sitting undeveloped. So Mobil saw very little point in trying to discover even more gas. Fast forward 25 years, however, and the energy dynamics and the gas market in particular has changed dramatically. There's now a burgeoning both domestic market as well as a regional market. And we see a great opportunity to become not only a significant supplier domestically, but also in the region, and particularly South Africa, which is a very large gas market, which is on our doorstep and is facing a supply shortage by the mid-2020s.
So is there enough gas then in this find to make the country energy independent?
So if our exploration campaign is successful and we discover what we believe is there, then not only will the country have the ability to become energy independent, but also a net energy exporter. And that can be in multiple forms. There's a lot of ways of monetizing gas now. You've got gas to power, you've got fertilizer, you've got small-scale LNG as well as petrochemicals. So all of those can play a mix and ensure that Zimbabwe becomes a net energy exporter.
And what does this mean for the local economy, and particularly for jobs for many of the local people?
Well, for a discovery that has this sort of potential in terms of its size, it will be an absolute huge boost for the economy, and as well as jobs that will naturally follow. So, you're talking about thousands of jobs during the construction and development phase, directly at the project. Then in the operations phase, that'll taper down, but then that'll also result in a lot of jobs created in the midstream and the downstream sectors. And so you're going to have a boost not only to the overall economy and significant contribution to the fiscus, but a lot of jobs created as well.
And just for clarity's sake, you're employing local people now, or are you relying on outside expertise to get to the oil and gas?
So we've got a mix of, in our team, in our headquarters in Perth is mainly where our technical work is undertaken. Sadly, we don't have the expertise in Zimbabwe in the oil and gas sector, but we're hoping to develop those skills and local skills as we go and as our program advances. However, in our Harare office, that's entirely staffed by locals. And in fact, our country manager there actually ran Mobil's previous exploration program. So he's very well versed and will be great for the upcoming operations. And now that we're on the ground and commencing our field activities, our presence in country will also start to ramp up as well. So there'll be more local employment too as part of the project.
Right. Okay. And what about the funding? Are you sufficiently funded or to make sure that you can see this project through?
So we're funded for our forward field program coming up. And in addition, we're aiming to conclude a partnering program to bring in an additional partner by the end of the year. And then that'll see us funded for the drilling campaign coming up.
As for the government of Zimbabwe, do they have a stake in this at all? Will they be relying on tax revenue?
So at the moment, we're in the midst of finalizing a production sharing agreement with the government. and that will result in the country receiving a portion of either the product or the profit over and above the normal taxes and royalties. So this production sharing agreement will ensure that the country gets a fair share of her resources by implementing this.
All right, Scott McMillan, thank you very much for speaking to us from Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Derine Abougheda from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.